Mises did not merely refute Marx. He exposed his contradictions so devastatingly that the entire Marxist system collapsed. In the 19th century, the so-called German philosopher and economist Karl Marx believed he had discovered the scientific laws governing human history. In his view, historical materialism revealed that all social evolution followed an inflexible and predetermined path, driven not by ideas or individual choices, but by impersonal material forces. Capitalism would collapse, and socialism would triumph, with the inexorability of a law of nature. Human action, moral argument, persuasion, and intellectual creativity would be illusions, mere reflections of much deeper economic structures. Marx presented his theory not as a philosophy, but as a science capable of predicting the future with accuracy and precision. Well then, in the following century, the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises quickly realized that this system could not stand. No, it was not merely flawed in one detail or another. Its entire logic rested on contradictions so deep that, once noticed, they brought down the whole theoretical edifice. Although Mises is best remembered as the economist who demonstrated the impossibility of economic calculation under socialism, he should also be recognized as the philosopher who dismantled the intellectual foundations of Marxism even before reaching economic analysis. He shows how the Marxist structure self-destructs. Marx's method contradicts his conclusions, and his conclusions contradict Marx's own way of life. The first crack in the Marxist system appears in its doctrine of historical determinism. After all, if only material forces determine the course of history, and if socialism triumphs inevitably, regardless of human intentions, then nothing Marx did during his life makes sense. Why write a manifesto? Why organize workers? Why agitate for a revolution that would come anyway? Mises insisted on this question because the answer reveals a devastating contradiction. Marx lived as if ideas mattered while simultaneously proclaiming that they were powerless. He devoted decades to trying to influence history through human action, propaganda, agitation, and persuasion, while his theory claimed that human action was irrelevant in the face of material forces. For Mises, this was not a simple oversight, but a demonstration that Marx did not truly believe in his own doctrine. If he had believed it, all activism would be useless. Marxism cannot explain the behavior of its own founder without abandoning its central principle. Historical determinism, once embraced, makes activism absurd. Yet this historical determinism was defended by an intensely activist man. This contradiction shows that Marx's theory fails, even by the standard of lived consistency. A second, equally devastating contradiction appears in the Marxist notion of polylogism, the idea that different social classes possess different logics. According to Marx, the bourgeois mind is incapable of understanding the world objectively. It can only produce ideology. The proletarians, by contrast, would possess the logic of historical truth. Marx used this device whenever critics pointed out flaws in his system. Their objections were dismissed as bourgeois logic. The criticism did not need to be answered because it came from the wrong class. Mises realized that this maneuver, if taken seriously, destroys Marxism from within. If all ideas are products of class conditions, then Marx's own ideas, produced by a man who never worked in a factory and lived thanks to the capitalist profits of Engels, are also bourgeois ideology. The Marxist cannot exempt his own theory from the principle he applies to all others. Either ideas can be evaluated rationally, or they cannot. If they can, polylogism is false. If they cannot, Marxism has no claim to truth whatsoever. Karl Marx's attempt to shield his theory by assigning truth to a specific class ends up invalidating it entirely. However, an even deeper contradiction appears when Marx claims that all of society, its laws, its institutions, its moral codes, and its intellectual traditions, originates from the so-called material productive forces. That is, tools, machines, and technologies. In this view, ideas are merely reflections of material conditions, not their causes. Change the tools, and society changes. Ideas would follow passively. Mises noted that this reverses cause and effect. Tools, machines, and technologies do not create themselves. They do not automatically emerge from material conditions. On the contrary, they are conceived, designed, and produced by human minds. For example, before a steam engine shapes industry, someone must think of the steam engine. Before tools exist, ideas must exist. Marx tried to explain ideas through tools, but tools exist only because ideas precede them, do they not? Therefore, social development cannot be explained by pointing to artifacts that presuppose the very intellectual creativity Marx denies. Thus, Marxism collapses into circularity. Ideas come from tools, but tools come from ideas. By denying the primacy of human action and thought, Marx makes it impossible to explain the origin of the very forces he claims govern history. The final failure, and perhaps the most profound one, identified by Mises concerns the content of socialism itself. Marx devoted thousands of pages to attacking capitalism, predicting its collapse, and promising a socialist future. Yet he refused to describe concretely how socialism would function. He called such analysis utopian, as if detailed planning were beneath the dignity of scientific socialism. Marx proposed overthrowing capitalism, but offered no framework to replace it. Mises later demonstrated that the absence of such a plan was not an accident, but the consequence of a fundamental impossibility. A socialist economy cannot perform rational economic calculation because, by abolishing private ownership of the means of production, it eliminates market prices for capital goods. Very well, but what is the problem with that? Without a reliable price system, several problems arise. There is no way to compare alternatives, no way to allocate resources efficiently, and no way to determine whether a particular production plan makes sense. Central planning becomes pure guesswork. And as Mises explained, socialism is synonymous with central planning. Marx never confronted this problem because he never asked how socialism would operate in practice. He promised prosperity without offering real mechanisms to achieve it. He criticized a functioning system while offering only abstractions in its place. The consequence, argued Mises, is that Marxism is not a scientific theory of society, but a collection of statements that refute one another. Consider the following. First, Marxism proclaims historical inevitability while simultaneously depending on activism. Second, it denounces ideology while assuming that its own theory is immune to ideological distortion. Third, it grounds ideas in material conditions while depending on ideas to explain the emergence of those very material conditions. Fourth, it calls for revolution while refusing to describe the society that this revolution is supposed to build. In this way, Marxism collapses not at the edges, but at its core. Universities continue to teach Marx as if these refutations had never occurred. But then again, what matters to academia is militancy and activism, not truth, at least for the vast majority of them. Understanding Ludwig von Mises's critique allows us to see through the contradictions that sustain Marxist thought. The debate is not merely economic, but philosophical, logical, and epistemological. Once we grasp these flaws, we realize that Marxism is not a grand theory of history, but a set of contradictory claims, maintained by rhetorical force rather than reason. Mises, often remembered only as the defender of economic calculation, should also be remembered as the thinker who revealed the intellectual bankruptcy of Marxism, providing us with the tools to dismantle the most influential and harmful ideology of the modern era, not with fallacies, but with reason and logic. Therefore, more than ever, it is necessary to say, less Marx, more Mises.